A storm of hoofbeats thundered across the plains of Europe in the spring of 1241. The Mongol war machine, an empire of mounted archers and brilliant generals, shattered kingdoms as it advanced. Their final obstacle was the army of Hungary, camped near a river called the Sajo. The battle that followed at Mohi would echo for centuries. What if a single decision had changed its outcome? This is a deep dive into the 35 key moments that decided the fate of a kingdom and perhaps a continent. You will witness the grand strategy, the brutal combat, and the mysterious twists that still puzzle historians today. How did the world's most disciplined army vanish after its greatest victory? What fatal mistake turned a fortified camp into a death trap? The answers lie in the cascade of decisions that began long before the first arrow flew. When you hear about a battle that changed history, what is the first moment you think decided it all? The Mongols moved with a terrifying purpose that winter. As the frozen rivers of Rus served as highways for their cavalry, the great city of Kiev fell after a brutal siege in December of 1240. Its destruction sent a shockwave of panic rippling westward. This was not a mere raid, it was a systematic conquest led by Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis, and his legendary strategist Subutai. Their force, a multi-ethnic army drawn from across the steppe, numbered in the tens of thousands, each warrior a master of mounted archery and capable of covering staggering distances. They were the sharp edge of an empire that now stretched from the Pacific to the gates of Europe. King Béla IV of Hungary received desperate refugees and grim reports, pieces of a puzzle revealing an enemy unlike any his kingdom had ever faced. He understood the existential threat. His response was a frantic call to arms, summoning every baron, knight, and soldier to the capital at Pest on the banks of the Danube. He also sent urgent pleas for aid to the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor, hoping to unite Christendom against this pagan storm. Yet in the courts of Western Europe, a dangerous disbelief took hold. The Mongols seemed a distant, almost mythical problem, a punishment for the faraway Eastern kingdoms. This critical failure of imagination, this delay in recognizing the scale of the danger, was the first silent domino to fall. While Béla scrambled to fortify the river crossings and gather his host, Subutai was already planning not just how to defeat the Hungarian army, but how to annihilate it completely. The stage was being set, and the distance between the two forces was closing with every passing day. Years before the Mongol banners appeared on the horizon, King Béla took a remarkably proactive step. He dispatched a small group of Dominican friars eastward, not as missionaries, but as spies. Their mission was to travel into the unknown lands beyond the Carpathian Mountains to gather intelligence on the rumored Mongol threat. These brave men, disguised as diplomats or simple travelers, ventured deep into territory already under the Khan's shadow. What they witnessed and reported back was nothing short of apocalyptic. They described an army of unparalleled discipline and mobility, a society organized entirely for war, and tactics that relied on feigned retreats and encirclements on a scale Europeans could scarcely comprehend. This was the single most valuable piece of military intelligence Hungary could have possessed, and it was utterly ignored. The reports from the friars were met with a wall of disbelief by the Hungarian nobility. To the proud knights and barons, steeped in the traditions of chivalric combat, the descriptions sounded like the exaggerated tales of frightened monks. How could an army of lightly armored horse archers possibly stand against the charge of a heavily armored knight, the pinnacle of martial power? The very concept of a strategic retreat, a core Mongol tactic, was seen as cowardice, not cunning. This fatal arrogance created a dangerous intelligence vacuum. Some historians even speculate that the Mongols, masters of psychological warfare, may have allowed these spies to see exactly what they wanted them to see, or perhaps even planted disinformation. Whether through active counterintelligence or simply the passive filter of cultural prejudice, the Hungarian high command entered the crisis blindfolded. They dismissed the one clear warning they had been given. This failure of imagination, this refusal to believe the evidence before them, meant that when the Mongol vanguard finally swept through the mountain passes, the Kingdom of Hungary was psychologically unprepared for what was coming. Their plans were built on a complete misunderstanding of the enemy, a mistake that would cost them everything. So, as the Hungarian army finally mustered at Pest, a force of perhaps 80,000 men, what was their strategy based on? Not on the friars' grim reports, but on their own deeply flawed assumptions. The Hungarian camp at Pest was a sprawling city of tents and banners, a gathering of strength. Yet into this tense assembly rode a group that would shatter its fragile unity. They were the Cumans, a nomadic Turkic people from the eastern steppes, and they arrived not as conquerors but as desperate refugees. Led by their Khan, Curtin, nearly 40,000 men, women, and children streamed across the Hungarian border, their possessions piled onto wagons, their stories filled with terror. They were fleeing the same unstoppable force that now threatened Hungary itself. To King Béla, their arrival seemed like a gift from God. Here was a large, battle-hardened cavalry force that knew the Mongols intimately, understood their tactics, and shared their mastery of the horse and bow. Granting them asylum was a strategic masterstroke, or so it seemed. He welcomed Khan Curtin, offered the Cumans lands to settle, and even had the Khan and his nobles baptized into the Christian faith to ease integration. Béla saw a powerful new ally, but the Hungarian nobility saw something very different. To the barons and bishops, the Cumans were pagans, strangers with alien customs, a potential fifth column inside the kingdom. Distrust curdled into hatred. Rumors spread like wildfire that the Cumans were actually Mongol spies, sent ahead to sow chaos. The crowded, anxious camp became a tinderbox of fear and prejudice. Then, the spark. In the town of Pest, just across the river from the royal camp, a mob of Hungarian soldiers and townspeople, whipped into a frenzy by these rumors, surrounded the house where Khan Curtin was staying. They dragged the Cuman leader out and murdered him in the street. The news exploded through the refugee camps. In grief and rage, the entire Cuman nation, Béla's would-be cavalry corps, packed their wagons, set fire to their temporary settlements, and fled southward out of Hungary, pillaging the countryside as they went. In a single violent afternoon, Béla lost 40,000 veteran horsemen and gained a new enemy at his back. This was more than a diplomatic disaster. It was a catastrophic self-inflicted wound on the eve of apocalypse. The kingdom was now fractured, distrustful, and materially weaker. As the Mongol scouts watched from afar, they saw a divided house, perfectly set for the breaking. The murder of Curtin left the Hungarian army demoralized and dangerously exposed. Yet on the morning of April 11, 1241, a spark of hope flared. Scouts reported a small force of Mongol riders harassing the outskirts of the Hungarian camp near the bridge over the Sajo River. To Duke Frederick of Austria, a headstrong ally who had brought his own contingent of knights, this was a glorious opportunity. Here was a chance for a quick, decisive victory, a chivalric charge that would send these Eastern devils packing. He rallied his men, and alongside him rode a contingent of the Knights Templar, the most elite and feared warriors in all of Christendom. They were the perfect hammer for this perceived nail. What they did not know was that they were not the hunters, but the very first prey. The Mongol riders they chased were not a vanguard, they were bait. This was the feigned retreat, a tactic perfected on the steppes over generations, and it was about to be executed with clinical precision. The Mongol horsemen skirmished briefly, letting loose a few volleys of arrows, then suddenly wheeled their horses and fled in apparent panic, dropping banners and even weapons to sell the illusion of a rout. To the Hungarian knights, it was confirmation of their superiority. Their blood was up. They broke into a full, thundering charge, eager to run down the fleeing cowards. They surged forward, leaving the safety of their fortified camp and the bulk of King Béla's army far behind. The trap was sprung. The fleeing Mongols did not scatter. They led their pursuers on a punishing, miles-long chase, drawing them deeper into broken, unfamiliar ground. The heavier European war horses and armored knights began to tire, their formation stretching and fragmenting. Exhaustion replaced exhilaration. Then, at a predetermined point, the Mongol riders stopped fleeing. They turned and were joined by fresh reserves hidden in the terrain. The panicked retreat transformed in an instant into a disciplined, encircling formation. The Hungarian vanguard, now isolated and winded, found itself surrounded by a ring of mounted archers who began to shower them with arrows from all sides. The charge that was meant to shatter the enemy had only succeeded in shattering their own army's cohesion. Duke Frederick and the Templars fought desperately, but they had been expertly led into a killing ground. Many were cut down. The survivors who straggled back to the main camp brought not victory, but the first taste of a terrifying new kind of warfare. They had wasted their strength, lost some of their best knights, and most crucially, taught the rest of the Hungarian army a lesson in despair. The Mongols had shown their hand, and it was a hand that held all the cards. The disastrous skirmish left the Hungarian command reeling, but they still held what they believed was an unshakable position. Their camp at Mohi was a fortress of earth and wagons, nestled in a seemingly perfect defensive spot. They had chosen to make their stand on a wide floodplain, but with their backs to a deep, fast-moving river, the Sajo, and their flank protected by a vast, nearly impassable marshland forest. To a medieval European commander, this was textbook brilliance. They had eliminated the threat of being surrounded, or so they thought. The river and woods would funnel any Mongol attack into a narrow frontal assault, right into the teeth of their heavy infantry and knights. It was a decision born from a defensive mindset and perhaps a lingering overconfidence. They had the numbers, they had the fortifications, and now they had the terrain. What could possibly go wrong? This choice of battlefield is one of the great geographical mysteries of the conflict. Why would a larger army, knowing the enemy's reputation for maneuver, voluntarily box itself in? One theory points to that fatal misreading of Mongol mobility. The Hungarian commanders likely believed the forest and river were absolute barriers. They could not conceive of an army moving through such terrain. A European army, with its heavy supply trains and infantry, could not. But the Mongols were not a European army. Their entire existence was built on moving across impossible landscapes with breathtaking speed. Another theory suggests a lack of unified command. The camp was a gathering of rival nobles, each with their own retinue. Choosing a wide open plain for a battle would have required complex, coordinated maneuvers and exposed individual lords to greater risk. The fortified camp was safer politically, a place where each baron could defend his own segment of the wall. It was a committee's decision, not a general's. And so, 80,000 men settled into their fortified trap, feeling secure behind their walls of wagons and earth, the river at their back a moat, the forest a shield. They waited for the Mongols to do the unthinkable, to charge headlong into their spears. They were waiting for a battle that would never come. The Mongols, surveying this setup from a distance, must have struggled to contain their satisfaction. Their enemy had done half the work for them. The Hungarians had built their own cage. Now, all the Mongols had to do was lock the door. The Hungarian army's sense of security now hinged on a single, solid structure, the stone bridge across the Sajo River. This was their lifeline, their only guaranteed route for supply, reinforcement, or though few dared think it, retreat. King Béla understood its importance, but his response to this critical vulnerability was dangerously half-hearted. He assigned a guard force to hold the bridge, a contingent strong enough to feel significant but fatally insufficient for the task ahead. It was likely composed of a few hundred knights and perhaps 1,000 infantry, men who looked at the thick stone arches and the rushing water below and felt a swell of confidence. They believed the bridge itself was their fortress. With the river on both sides and a narrow causeway to defend, they could hold against any number, or so the thinking went. This was another catastrophic misjudgment, a failure to grasp the Mongol way of war. The Hungarian command was planning for a conventional assault, a head-on clash of men on a narrow front where armored knights would shine. They did not consider that an enemy who crossed continents would see a river as a minor obstacle, not a barrier. The guards settled in, their watchfires flickering in the damp night air, convinced the stone beneath their feet made them safe. Their false sense of security was a thin veneer, about to be shattered by a plan of breathtaking audacity. While they watched the bridge, the Mongols were already looking past it. While the Hungarian sentries stared into the darkness from their stone bridge, the true threat was already in motion, unseen and unheard. That same night, under a cloak of absolute blackness, Subutai himself took command of a force of 30,000 warriors. Their mission was not to attack the bridge, but to make it irrelevant. In a maneuver of staggering boldness, they turned their backs on the entire Hungarian army and began a silent, grueling march to the south. This was no simple flanking move. It was a deep strategic envelopment on a scale Europe had never witnessed. Each Mongol warrior moved with a ghostly discipline, their horses' hooves muffled, their armor and weapons secured to prevent any clatter. They were not just an army on the march. They were a shadow detaching itself from the night, a secret kept from 80,000 sleeping enemies. The risk was astronomical. If the Hungarians discovered their camp was only being held by a skeleton force, they could have surged out and crushed it. If Subutai failed to find a crossing, his entire contingent would be stranded, useless, and vulnerable at dawn. Yet Subutai, the old master, bet everything on the Hungarians' rigid thinking and his own army's supernatural endurance. For hours they pressed south, through unfamiliar, marshy terrain, scouts feeling their way forward in the pitch dark. Their objective was not a bridge, but something far more humble and far more deadly, a shallow point in the river, a ford that local guides or their own reconnaissance had revealed. Finding it in the darkness was a test of will and skill. Imagine the tension in that silent column. Every man knowing the fate of the entire campaign rested on this stealthy trek. As the first gray hints of dawn touched the eastern sky, they found it, a stretch of river where the water ran wide and slow over a gravel bed. Without a sound, the vanguard began to lead their hardy steppe ponies into the icy current. They were crossing the Sajo, not at the fortified bridge where the Hungarians waited, but miles behind their entire line. This midnight march was the masterstroke, the single maneuver that transformed the Hungarian fortress into a prison. While King Béla's army slept, believing the river secured their flank, Subutai was quietly moving an entire army into position to slam the door shut behind them. The ford was a ribbon of dark water whispering over smooth stones. In the pre-dawn gloom, Subutai's lead scouts signaled back. They had found it. The exact location is lost to time, but many historians point to a crossing near the village of Sharinx, miles south of the stone bridge and the sleeping Hungarian camp. This was not a stroke of luck. It was the culmination of a ruthless intelligence operation. The Mongol army traveled with a corps of scouts and engineers whose sole purpose was to know the land better than the people who lived there. They would have interrogated every captured peasant, every local hunter, every wandering trader for weeks in advance, piecing together a detailed mental map of every stream, hill, and hidden path. They likely also sent out small, fast-moving patrols days before the main army arrived, testing riverbanks and probing the forests. So when Subutai ordered his night march, he did not wander blindly hoping for a miracle. He marched with a specific destination in mind, a geographical weakness his enemy had overlooked because they assumed no one could cross there. This moment, the quiet confirmation of the ford's location, was the pivot point of the entire battle. It transformed the Hungarian army's greatest asset, the river guarding their flank, into their greatest liability. That secure barrier was now a back door, and 30,000 of the world's most disciplined soldiers were about to walk right through it. As the first Mongol riders urged their horses into the chilly current, the fate of the Kingdom of Hungary was sealed not with a clash of steel, but with the soft sound of water parting around determined legs. Dawn broke not with silence, but with a sudden, shattering cacophony at the stone bridge. Just as Subutai's last riders were emerging from the river to the south, Batu Khan unleashed a ferocious, full-scale assault on the Hungarian guards holding the vital crossing. This was no probing attack. It was a spectacle of violence designed to be seen and heard for miles. Mongol catapults, light and mobile, hurled not just stones but pots of burning naphtha across the river, painting the morning sky with streaks of fire and oily black smoke. Clouds of arrows descended in whistling waves, pinning the defenders behind their shields. The roar of drums, the blare of horns, and the thunder of thousands of hooves converging on the bridgehead created an overwhelming sensory storm. To every Hungarian soldier in the main camp, the message was terrifyingly clear. The main Mongol attack was here, right now, at the bridge. All eyes, all fear, and all reinforcements were instinctively drawn to this point of maximum pressure. They were witnessing a masterclass in misdirection. Batu's assault was the anvil, a fixed, immovable point of brutal confrontation. Its purpose was not to take the bridge immediately, but to hold the entire Hungarian army's gaze. to convince King Béla that this was the decisive battle. Every knight who tightened his grip on his lance, every commander who shouted orders to shore up the bridge defenses, was playing into Subutai's plan. They were focusing all their energy on the front door, while the back door was already swinging silently open behind them. The Hungarians, believing they were meeting the enemy's main force, committed their reserves and their attention to a fight that was, in truth, the grandest of decoys. The real hammer was already raised, dripping with river water, and poised to fall on their undefended rear. The Hungarian knights saw their moment and seized it. As the Mongol assault on the bridge reached its peak, a wave of reinforcements from the main camp surged forward, their armor gleaming in the chaotic light of the fires. The heavily armored cavalry, the pride of Europe, lowered their lances and thundered onto the stone causeway. This was the kind of fight they understood, a direct, brutal clash on a narrow front where weight and courage decided the day. And it worked. The Mongol horsemen, skilled at harassment but lighter in armor, could not withstand the concentrated impact of that steel-tipped charge. They were pushed back, their formations breaking under the relentless pressure. Arrows glanced off plate armor, and the close-quarters melee favored the Hungarian knights' longer swords and heavier maces. To every man fighting on that bridge, the tide was turning. Cheers rose from the Hungarian lines as the Mongols appeared to falter, their lines dissolving into what looked like a genuine retreat. The guards, bloody but triumphant, held the bridge. They had done their duty. They had repelled the main enemy attack. A powerful, intoxicating sense of victory swept through the Hungarian ranks. Commanders congratulated each other, believing they had weathered the storm and broken the Mongol will. This perceived success was a poison pill. It confirmed all their biases, that European heavy cavalry was unbeatable in a straight fight, that the Mongols' tricks were no match for raw valor. So instead of questioning why the enemy had committed to such a costly frontal assault, they doubled down. More troops were funneled toward the bridgehead to press the apparent advantage, to turn the Mongol retreat into a rout. The entire Hungarian army's center of gravity shifted, leaning forward into this single, brutal engagement. They were committing their strength, their focus, and their hope to a fight that was, in the grand scheme, a magnificent distraction. Every knight locked in combat on that bridge, every archer sending arrows across the river, was completely unaware that the true battle had already been decided miles away. The doom they thought they had defeated was simply resetting its jaws, preparing to close from an entirely different direction. Their glorious counterattack had not won the day, it had merely tightened the noose. The sudden thunder of drums did not come from the bridge. It rolled from the dense forest to the south, a direction the Hungarians believed was secured by impassable wilderness. As King Béla's commanders shouted orders to reinforce the front, a new line of banners broke from the tree line. These were not the familiar standards of European lords. They were the horsetail standards and fluttering yak tails of the Mongol Tumans. Subutai's entire flanking force, 30,000 strong and now rested after their crossing, emerged in perfect battle order. They did not charge immediately. Instead, they began to fan out with a chilling, mechanical precision, forming a wide, crescent-shaped line that began to curl around the entire rear of the Hungarian encampment. The visual shock was absolute. For a Hungarian soldier turning from the noise at the bridge, the sight was a physical blow, a second, larger enemy army materializing where no army could possibly be. The river they had trusted at their back was now at their front, and the enemy they had been fighting was now behind them. A wave of raw, disbelieving panic crashed through the ranks. The orderly camp dissolved into chaos. Knights scrambled for horses that were not saddled. Infantry formations meant to face east now twisted in confusion to face west, and the desperate shouts of officers were drowned out by the rising Mongol war cries and the relentless, unnerving beat of their drums. The fortress had become a cage, and the hunters were now completely surrounded. In that single, horrifying moment, every assumption that had guided the Hungarian strategy evaporated. The battle was no longer about holding a bridge. It was about simple survival. The chaos of the encirclement was soon painted in fire. As Subutai's flanking force tightened its crescent, Batu Khan's assault at the bridge escalated into something truly infernal. Historical accounts from the time, like the Chronicle of Roger of Tora Magir, describe a rain of terror falling from the sky. The Mongol catapults, light and fast-moving traction trebuchets, launched more than a stone. They hurled clay pots that shattered on impact, releasing a sticky, burning liquid that water could not extinguish. This was likely naphtha, a crude form of petroleum that burns with a thick, black smoke, or perhaps a version of the legendary Greek fire whose secret the Byzantines guarded so closely. The psychological impact of this weapon on the packed Hungarian camp was beyond calculation. Imagine the scene from the ground. A soldier is already reeling from the shock of being surrounded, his world narrowed to the clash of steel and the screams of horses. Then, from above, comes a strange arcing pot that smashes against a wooden supply wagon. Instantly, a wave of liquid flame erupts, clinging to everything it touches: wood, cloth, flesh. The fire spreads with a terrifying hunger, leaping from wagon to tent in a camp crammed with flammable material. The air fills with an acrid, choking smoke that stings the eyes and sears the lungs, cutting visibility to a few feet. This was not just a weapon of destruction, it was a weapon of absolute panic. It attacked the one thing the Hungarians had left, their sense of a secure position. Their fortified wagons, meant to be walls, became pyres. The orderly rows of tents became a labyrinth of fire. The cohesive army shattered into thousands of isolated, terrified individuals, each fighting their own private battle against an element that felt like divine punishment. The debate among historians is whether this barrage was a decisive tactical tool or a masterstroke of psychological warfare. The actual number of casualties from the fire might have been secondary. Its true purpose was to amplify the confusion, to turn a structured defense into a stampede, and to signal in the most visceral way possible that there was no safe ground, not even at the heart of their own camp. In that choking, burning hellscape, any remaining thought of organized resistance melted away. Morale is a fortress built on order, and that fortress now collapsed into dust. The Hungarian army did not break unit by unit. It dissolved man by man. Imagine a knight, his squire killed by a stray arrow, fumbling with the unfamiliar buckles of his own armor as the acrid smoke from the burning wagon stung his eyes and filled his lungs. Around him, infantrymen who had stood in disciplined ranks moments before were now scattering like leaves in a gale, some dropping their weapons to run faster, others simply standing frozen in place, overwhelmed by the sensory nightmare. The air was a cacophony of impossible contradictions: the deep-throated war drums from the forest, the high-pitched screams of wounded horses, the crackle of flames, and the guttural shouts of Mongol warriors closing in from two directions at once. This was the psychological breaking point. An army can endure casualties if it believes in its formation and its purpose, but here there was no formation left to believe in. The attack from the rear by Subutai's force did more than create a tactical disadvantage. It created a fundamental rupture in reality. For a soldier, the rear is where the baggage train is, where the surgeons set up, where safety lies. When that space suddenly becomes the front line, the entire mental map of the battle shatters. There is no behind anymore, only a tightening circle of death. Knights who moments before had been heroes holding the bridge now found themselves irrelevant, their heavy horses useless in a choked camp of fire and fleeing men. The will to fight did not drain away, it evaporated in an instant, replaced by a primal, all-consuming directive to survive. This collapse was not a failure of courage, but a failure of context. Every rule of war they knew had been rewritten in front of them, and in that terrifying blank space, only panic could grow. Amidst the smoke and screams, a single command echoed from the royal standard. King Béla, witnessing the encirclement and the inferno consuming his supplies, made the most agonizing decision of his life. He gave the order to abandon the camp. This was not a tactical retreat to a secondary position. It was a desperate command for a general breakout, a headlong rush to escape the tightening ring of death by pushing west, away from the river and the main Mongol force. On the surface, it seemed like the only choice left. Staying meant being burned or slaughtered where they stood, but this fateful order transformed the battle's final act. Was it the last, necessary gamble for survival, Or was it a catastrophic, premature admission of defeat that sealed their doom? By ordering the breakout, Béla effectively surrendered every advantage they still possessed. He abandoned the fortified wagon walls that, though burning, could have provided pockets of resistance. He abandoned the bulk of their food, water, and spare weapons, dooming any escapees to starvation. Most critically, he abandoned any last shred of organized command. The order to break out was interpreted by 70,000 panicked men as one simple word: run. What followed was not a fighting withdrawal, it was a stampede. Knights, infantry, and camp followers all funneled into a chaotic mass, jamming the few open pathways out of the camp. Discipline vanished completely. The mighty Hungarian army ceased to be an army at all, becoming instead a vast, slow-moving target, its back turned to the most lethal cavalry on earth. In that moment, King Béla may have believed he was saving what remained of his kingdom's strength. In reality, he had just given the Mongol hunters the perfect prey. The narrow gap between the river and the woods was called the Kapolna Pass. It was a natural corridor, perhaps a few hundred yards wide, and it became the throat of a slaughterhouse. As the panicked Hungarian host fled the burning camp, their tens of thousands funneled into this single, constricting passage. What had moments before been a chaotic mob now became a densely packed, slow-moving river of humanity. Knights in heavy armor, exhausted infantry, terrified squires, and even the non-combatant camp followers were all pressed together, shoulder to shoulder, their movement grinding to a terrified crawl. The crush was so intense that men suffocated, trampled by the sheer weight of their own comrades pushing from behind. In this horrific bottleneck, every advantage of the European warrior vanished. A knight could not raise his sword, an archer could not draw his bow. They were not soldiers anymore, they were targets in a shooting gallery, and the Mongols, masters of terrain, had anticipated this exact moment. They did not charge in with swords. They held the high ground on the flanks of the pass, and from the trees, and they began a methodical, merciless rain of arrows. The sky itself seemed to darken with their volleys. Arrows fell in a continuous, whistling hail, piercing armor at close range, finding gaps in helms, striking the unprotected horses first to create even more obstacles. There was no shield wall to form, no direction from which to defend. Death came from above, from the sides, from behind. The screams of the wounded blended with the shrieks of horses and the relentless thrum of bowstrings. This was not combat, it was systematic extermination. The Kapolna Pass did not witness a battle's climax, but its gruesome, efficient conclusion. The geography the Hungarians had chosen for safety had now been turned against them with brutal, final precision, transforming their retreat into a tomb of their own making. The arrows fell not in volleys, but in a continuous, horizontal storm. As the Hungarian column choked the Kapolna Pass, the Mongol horse archers executed their most devastating tactic. They did not charge headlong into the mass. Instead, they split into smaller, fluid groups and rode parallel to the struggling lines of knights and infantry, maintaining a precise distance of about 50 to 100 yards. From this moving platform, each archer could unleash a shot every 5 to 10 seconds, drawing from a quiver that held 60 or more arrows. The effect was like a moving wall of lethal needles, sweeping along the entire length of the trapped army. The mechanics of this kill zone were brutally efficient. The Mongols used a composite bow made of layers of wood, horn, and sinew, a weapon of stunning power that could punch through chainmail and even pierce thinner plate armor at close range. Their arrowheads were not uniform, they were specialized tools. Some had narrow, needle-like points designed to penetrate armor links. Others had wide, barbed heads meant to tear flesh and create horrific, debilitating wounds on unarmored men and horses. The sheer density of the Hungarian retreat worked against them completely. A Mongol archer did not need to aim at a specific soldier. He simply loosed his arrow into the seething crowd, and it was almost certain to find a target. The psychological torment was as potent as the physical damage. For a Hungarian knight, there was no enemy to engage, no honorable duel to be fought. There was only the whistle of an unseen shaft, the sudden cry of the man next to him, and the terrifying knowledge that the riders delivering this death would never stand still long enough to be caught. This was not a battle of strength against strength. It was a harvest. Amidst the arrows and the screams, a single figure stood out against the tide of panic. He was not a king or a general, but a man of the cloth wearing the armor of a knight. Archbishop Ugrin Sisak of Kaluksa was a living paradox, a high priest who was also a legendary warrior. In a kingdom where bishops often led armies, he was the most formidable of them all. As the retreat dissolved into chaos, he did not flee. Instead, he planted his banner in the bloody mire of the Kapolna Pass and began shouting for men to rally to him. His voice, accustomed to echoing through cathedrals, now boomed over the din of battle, a desperate attempt to forge a pocket of order from the wreckage. For a moment, it seemed to work. A handful of knights and men at arms, seeing the familiar symbol of their faith held high by an armored archbishop, coalesced around him. They formed a makeshift shield wall, a tiny island of defiance in the river of death. Ugrin fought with a ferocity that inspired those near him, his mace crushing Mongol skulls as he roared prayers and curses in the same breath. He was not just defending his life, he was defending the very idea that God and steel could still prevail. His death, therefore, was more than the loss of a brave commander. It was a profound symbolic rupture. When a Mongol arrow finally found a gap in his armor or a sword cut him down, the chronicles disagree on the exact manner. The last bastion of organized resistance in the pass fell with him. The men who had rallied to his cross now scattered, their last flicker of hope extinguished. In that moment, the Hungarian kingdom lost both a spiritual shepherd and a martial champion. His death signaled that divine favor had abandoned the field, and mortal courage alone was not enough. The protection of heaven and the strength of chivalry, the twin pillars of medieval power, had both been broken on the plains of Mohi. The king's survival now depended on speed and anonymity. As the Kapolna Pass became a charnel house, Béla IV and a tight knot of his most trusted knights hacked their way clear of the Mongol encirclement. It was not a glorious charge, but a brutal, desperate scramble through the chaos, using the sheer press of panicked men as a momentary screen. Once free of the immediate killing zone, they did not pause. Stripping the distinctive royal insignia from their surcoats and exchanging their exhausted, heavier warhorses for the swiftest coursers they could seize from fleeing stragglers, they transformed from a royal guard into a band of anonymous riders. Their goal was the Danube and the relative safety of the western fortress of Pressburg, modern-day Bratislava. This was a ride fueled by terror and duty. Every distant plume of dust could be a Mongol patrol, every sound in the forest a potential ambush. The king who had commanded 80,000 men that morning was now a fugitive in his own kingdom, his crown a liability, his survival the only flickering hope for his nation's continuity. He would not stop at Pressburg, pushing onward into Austria, seeking refuge with Duke Frederick, the very ally whose rash charge had begun the disaster. Béla's escape was a tactical miracle, but it was also a profound moral weight. He lived, but he had left the flower of Hungarian nobility and the core of its military strength to be slaughtered on the plains of Mohi. His kingdom now lay utterly exposed, its heart ripped out, its fate resting on the shoulders of a single fleeing monarch. What does a king carry with him when he outruns the ruin of his army? Not just his life, but the entire burden of a future that must be rebuilt from ashes. The silence after the battle was more terrible than the noise of it. While King Béla and his nobles spurred their horses west, the fields and marshes around Mohi were left to the dead and the dying. The focus of history often follows the fleeing king, but the true staggering cost of the battle was paid by the tens of thousands of common soldiers, the infantry, the lesser knights, the camp followers who had no swift horse for escape. They were the ones trapped in the Kapolna Pass or scattered across the waterlogged plain, and for them, the Mongol pursuit was a final, merciless harvest. Chroniclers of the time, like Thomas of Spoleto, wrote of landscapes transformed by carnage, of fields so thick with corpses that one could walk from body to body for miles without touching the ground. The Sajo River, they said, ran red for days. These are not mere metaphors, they are echoes of a demographic catastrophe. An army of perhaps 80,000 had been effectively erased. The lucky ones fell in the initial arrow storm or the crush of the retreat. The unlucky ones were run down in the open by Mongol riders who showed no quarter, driven into the very marshes they had believed would protect their flank, and drowned in the mud under the weight of their own armor. This was not a battle with prisoners, it was an extermination. To understand the scale, we must look to a chilling Mongol practice. After major victories, they conducted a grim census of the dead. Soldiers would move methodically across the field, and for each fallen enemy, they would cut off an ear, collecting them in large sacks made of leather or cloth. These grisly trophies were then counted to provide a precise tally for their commanders, a bureaucratic record of slaughter. Contemporary reports, though possibly exaggerated by terror, claim the ears of the Hungarian dead filled multiple large sacks. Imagine the scene, not of battle, but of this quiet, systematic harvesting in a field of the slain. Each ear represented a father, a farmer, a craftsman from a Hungarian village or town, a life extinguished far from home. This moment, the counting of the dead, marks the transition from a military defeat to a national trauma. The kingdom did not just lose an army, it lost a generation of its men. The empty villages, the untilled fields, the silent workshops that followed, were the true and lasting victory for the Mongols, a hollowing out that would take decades to heal. The piles of bodies were a message, written in flesh and blood, to any who might think of resisting again. The slaughter at the pass was only the beginning. For the scattered remnants of the Hungarian army, the battle's end brought no mercy, only a new and more terrifying phase. The Mongols did not stop to loot the camp or celebrate. Their doctrine demanded total victory, which meant the complete destruction of the enemy's ability to ever fight again. So they fanned out across the Pannonian Plain in small, fast-moving detachments, beginning a pursuit that would last for days. This was not a chase, it was a systematic cleansing. The Hungarian knights and infantry who had escaped the initial kill zone were exhausted, wounded, and utterly demoralized. Their heavy armor, once a mark of pride, now became an unbearable weight under the spring sun. Their horses, bred for the shock of a charge, were spent after hours of combat and panic. They stumbled across the open grasslands, seeking the shelter of distant forests or villages, each man alone in a vast, suddenly hostile landscape, and always just on the horizon were the dust clouds of the Mongol riders. The Mongols operated with a critical advantage that made this pursuit possible: their string of fresh horses. Each warrior traveled with 3, 4, sometimes 5 extra mounts. These hardy steppe ponies were rotated constantly, allowing a Mongol trooper to cover 60, 70, even 100 miles in a single day without tiring his primary warhorse. Imagine the despair of a fleeing Hungarian knight, his single, magnificent destrier lathered and slowing to a walk, looking back to see a group of riders effortlessly closing the distance on horses that seemed as fresh as if they had just left the stable. The Mongols would ride a horse hard for a few hours, then switch to a new one, maintaining a relentless pace that no European army could match. They ran down stragglers not with a furious charge, but with a chilling, inevitable trot. Survivors were hunted into woods, cornered in farmhouses, or driven into rivers and cut down. The chronicler Roger of Torre-Maggiore, who lived through this terror, did not call it a military defeat. He gave it a far more profound and terrifying name. He called it the Day of the Lord. To the medieval Christian mind, this phrase was loaded with apocalyptic meaning. It was drawn from the Old Testament prophets, a term for a time of divine wrath and judgment, when God would pour out punishment on a sinful people. For the Hungarians, the inexplicable speed, the strange weapons of fire, the total annihilation of their proud host, it all felt supernatural. This was not the work of men, they believed, but a scourge sent by heaven itself. The plains of Mohi were not just a battlefield, they became an altar of sacrifice, and the relentless pursuit was the final, inescapable sentence. The kingdom had not merely been beaten, it had been judged. Not all who fled died running. In the chaos of the retreat, a group of survivors, a mix of Hungarian knights, infantry, and perhaps even some of the Cuman refugees who had not fled the kingdom, saw a sliver of high ground and seized upon a last desperate hope. They dragged their remaining wagons, some still smoldering from the fire attack, up a gentle hill and lashed them together into a traditional Wagenburg, a wagon fortress. This was an old tactic, used for centuries by armies on the move to create an instant, fortified camp. The wagons were chained wheel to wheel, forming a crude but sturdy circular wall. Gaps between them were plugged with shields, broken spears, and anything else they could find. Inside this trembling ring stood perhaps a few hundred men, the last organized fragment of a shattered host. They were exhausted, wounded, and surrounded, but within the wooden walls of their makeshift fort, they found a grim purpose. For a few hours, they held the hill. Archers positioned themselves between the wagons, picking their shots as Mongol patrols circled below. Knights, their armor dented and bloodied, stood ready at the gaps with sword and axe. It was a pocket of defiant order in a sea of ruin, a final testament to the human instinct to resist even when hope is gone. The Mongols, however, did not waste men on a reckless charge. They recognized the strength of the position and treated it with a chillingly methodical approach. First, they tightened the ring, ensuring no one could slip out. Then, they began a slow, deliberate bombardment. Mounted archers rode in concentric circles around the base of the hill, each pass sending a focused storm of arrows arcing over the wagon walls. The defenders had little shelter. Arrows thudded into wood and shield, but many found flesh. The air inside the fort grew thick with the sounds of pain and the metallic smell of blood. The Mongols were not just killing, they were eroding, wearing down the last of their enemy's strength and will. Finally, when the return fire from the hill had grown weak and sporadic, the signal was given. A concentrated assault surged forward. Warriors on foot, protected by large shields, rushed the wagon barricade, hacking at the chains and wheels with axes while others poured through the breaches. The fight that followed was short, brutal, and absolute. The last defenders were cut down where they stood, fighting back to back in the shrinking space within their own walls. The Mongols left no survivors. This final, isolated stand on a nameless hill is one of the battle's most poignant mysteries. Who were these men? Were they common soldiers who found a leader in their desperation, or a noble lord making a final, futile gesture of honor? Their identities are lost, swallowed by the same silence that followed the last clash of steel. Their Wagenburg was not a strategic objective. It held no king, no treasure. Its significance is purely human. It represents that final, flickering moment between hope and oblivion, the choice to shape the manner of one's end even when the outcome is certain. In their desperate circle of wagons, they created not just a fort, but a monument to the will that persisted even after the battle was lost. The fate of Duke Frederick of Austria is a ghost story written into the chaos of the retreat. He was there at the beginning, leading that ill-fated charge against the Mongol decoys, and then he was simply gone. No chronicler records seeing him fall in glory, no messenger brought news of his capture, and his body was never identified among the countless dead. A prince of the realm, a leader of men, vanished from history as completely as any common foot soldier. This disappearance is more than a personal tragedy. It is a window into the absolute disintegration of order on that day. In the chivalric world, a nobleman's death was a public event. His armor, his banner, his heraldry, these were meant to ensure his story was recorded, that his lineage knew of his honorable end. At Mohi, that system broke down. The very symbols that were meant to protect his identity became meaningless in the crush of the Kapolna Pass or the relentless pursuit across the plains. So what happened to him? Historians are left with only shadows and theories. The first is the simplest and most likely. He was killed anonymously in the rout. A stray arrow, a trampling horse, a fatal wound from a nameless Mongol rider, his body, stripped of its valuable armor by scavengers after the battle, would have been just another face in the mountain of corpses, his identity erased by the scale of the slaughter. A second, darker theory suggests capture and a silent execution. The Mongols were adept at identifying high-value targets, and a duke would have been a prize. Yet there's no record of him being paraded or ransomed, which leads some to believe he may have been killed shortly after being taken, perhaps during a failed escape attempt or as part of the Mongols' methodical clearing of the field. A third possibility offers a sliver of grim hope, that he escaped the immediate battlefield only to succumb to his wounds days later, dying alone in a forest or a peasant's hut, his final moments as unrecorded as his last battle. Duke Frederick's empty grave represents a profound historical rupture. His vanishing act underscores how the Battle of Mohi did not just kill individuals. It erased lineages, severed family histories, and left questions where there should have been epic. For every named duke who disappeared, there were 100 lesser knights and lords whose fates vanished with him, their stories dissolved into the bloody mud of the Sajo floodplain. When an entire social order is built on knowing who fought and who fell, what does it mean when so many simply become unknown? The final screams faded into the wind, replaced by the low hum of flies and the methodical sounds of work. With the pursuit complete, the Mongol army returned to the plains of Mohi not as warriors, but as auditors of ruin. The Hungarian camp, once a bustling fortress city, now lay as a sprawling, silent treasury of defeat. This was the moment of plunder, a systematic and highly organized process that transformed the spoils of war into fuel for an empire. For the Mongols, the loot was not a mere bonus, it was a core strategic objective, the economic engine of their conquest. The camp of King Béla and his nobles was arguably the richest single prize in all of Eastern Europe, a concentration of wealth gathered for a royal campaign. Gold and silver chalices from noble dinner services, ornate reliquaries from the bishop's tents, heavy coins from the royal treasury, and finely wrought jewelry were all gathered with dispassionate efficiency. But the real treasure was in the material of war itself. Thousands of suits of high-quality steel plate and chainmail armor, finely tempered swords from German workshops, lances tipped with polished steel, and sturdy European warhorses that had survived the carnage, all were collected, cataloged, and packed on a captured wagon. Imagine the scene, not of chaotic greed, but of orderly redistribution. A Mongol soldier might trade 3 heavy European breastplates, useless for his style of mounted archery, to a supply officer for a single, superior composite bow or a string of fresh ponies. The precious metals would be melted down into ingots for easy transport and future minting. This immense transfer of wealth did 2 critical things. First, it directly funded the next phase of the Mongol advance into Central Europe, paying for supplies, rewarding troops, and financing the siege engines that would be needed for cities like Pest. Second, and just as importantly, it was a powerful psychological and political signal. By stripping the Hungarian nobility of their literal symbols of power, their armor, their swords, their gold, the Mongols were demonstrating a total victory that went beyond the battlefield. They were not just defeating an army, they were dismantling the very apparatus of its society, repurposing its strength for their own ends. The plunder of Mohi was a transaction where the pride of a kingdom was exchanged for the momentum of an empire. The dust settled over the plains, and a strange quiet descended. With the Hungarian army annihilated and King Béla a fugitive, the path westward lay open and undefended. Yet the Mongol riders did not surge forward in hot pursuit. Subutai, the master strategist, called a halt. This decision not to immediately chase the fleeing king into Austria is one of the most debated puzzles of the entire campaign. It seems to defy the very logic of their earlier relentless pursuit. Why stop at the moment of total victory? The first theory is one of pure military necessity. The battle at Mohi, while a crushing triumph, was not cost-free for the Mongols. They had fought a hard engagement, expended vast numbers of arrows, and their horses, though hardy, needed rest and grazing after the intense maneuvering and the long night march. More importantly, they now sat in the middle of a conquered, but not yet secured territory. The royal capital of Pest lay just a few days' ride away, its walls still manned and its treasury intact. To chase Béla with their main force would leave their rear vulnerable to a counterattack from any surviving Hungarian garrisons or a rebellion from the towns they had bypassed. Subutai may have decided that consolidating their grip on the heart of Hungary was a more urgent priority than capturing a single, symbolically important man. The second theory looks to the landscape itself. Beyond the Danube, the terrain rose toward the Alpine foothills. For an army born of the open steppe, mountains represented a formidable psychological and logistical barrier. Their strength was in speed, maneuver, and the use of mounted archers, advantages that would be nullified in narrow mountain passes where a small defending force could hold back an army. Subutai, a man who studied geography as intently as any enemy, may have viewed the Alps not as a gateway, but as a wall, one that made a deep raid into Austria or Germany a risky proposition without first securing a firm base. But the most compelling theory is that this pause was always part of a larger, colder calculation. The Mongol campaign operated on a seasonal clock. It was now mid-April. They had perhaps 6 months before the harsh Carpathian winter would make movement and supply difficult. Subutai's grand strategy likely envisioned the summer and autumn as a time for methodically reducing the fortified cities of Hungary, like Pest and Esztergom, gathering intelligence, and allowing their armies to regroup and resupply from the plunder of Mohi. The goal was not a raid, but a permanent conquest. Capturing Béla would have been a bonus, but securing the agricultural plains of the Pannonian Basin, a landscape eerily similar to their home steppes and perfect for their horses, was the real prize. This was not a missed opportunity, but a deliberate choice. The hunter, having brought down the great beast, now turned to methodically claiming its territory, ensuring that when the time came to move again, there would be no threat left behind. The king could run, for now, because the land he was running from was already being erased from his grasp. The silence across the Hungarian countryside was not empty, it was watchful. With the army gone, the surviving population hid in forests and marshes, a scattered, terrified remnant that could have become a persistent thorn in the Mongol side. A prolonged guerrilla war in unfamiliar terrain was a real risk, one that could bleed the invaders slowly over months, so the Mongols, masters of the next move, initiated a campaign not of terror, but of chilling persuasion. They sent out riders under flags of truce, not to towns, but into the wild places where the people hid. These envoys carried a simple, direct message for the peasants, the farmers, the families who had lost everything. They were told to return to their homes, to tend their fields, and to submit to Mongol rule. In exchange, they would be spared, their lives would continue. This was not an act of mercy, it was a masterstroke of psychological and political strategy. Think about the mental state of a Hungarian villager at that moment. The world has ended, the king is gone, the army is slaughtered, and strange, victorious warriors now control the land. The instinct is to fight, to hide, to resist in any small way possible. But then comes this offer, this clear path back to something resembling normalcy. For a father worried about feeding his children, the promise of safety and the chance to harvest his crops is a powerful lure. It exploits the most basic human need, the desire for survival and stability. By offering this, the Mongols were effectively disarming the population without a fight. They were transforming potential rebels into docile subjects, and more importantly, into a functioning agricultural base. This was the first step in turning Hungary from a conquered battlefield into a productive province of the Mongol Empire. The fields needed to be plowed, the livestock tended, the taxes collected. Dead peasants produced nothing, but living, submissive peasants produced the grain and goods that fuel further conquest. This move revealed the true scope of Subutai's vision. He was not just a destroyer of armies, he was a builder of empires. The battle had won the land, but this quiet, calculated offer was meant to win the people, or at least their compliance. It showcased a long-term imperial strategy that looked beyond the immediate glory of victory to the hard, practical work of governance. The real conquest, it seemed, would be administered not with the sword, but with the promise of a return to the plow. The promise of a return to the plow was a fragile piece. For nearly a year, the Mongols solidified their hold on the Pannonian Plain, treating Hungary not as a raided territory, but as a new province of their empire. They established a system of taxation, appointed local administrators, and even minted coins. To all observers, this was a permanent occupation. The kingdoms of Austria and Croatia braced for the inevitable next wave, certain that the storm that had broken at Mohi would soon sweep over them. Europe held its breath, waiting for the final, crushing blow. Then, in the spring of 1242, something impossible happened. Without warning, the entire Mongol army, tens of thousands of warriors, their families, and their vast train of plunder, simply packed up and began to move. They were not advancing west. They were retreating east, back through the Carpathian passes from which they had emerged. The news spread through the terrified villages and into the courts of Europe like a shockwave of disbelief. One day they were there, an unshakable fact of life, and the next, they were a cloud of dust on the eastern horizon, leaving behind a shattered, silent land. This sudden, total withdrawal is the single greatest mystery of the Mongol invasion of Europe. Why would the world's most successful conquerors, at the peak of their power, with no army left to oppose them, voluntarily abandon a continent they seem poised to take? The leading theory points to an event that occurred thousands of miles away in the heart of the Mongol Empire. In December of 1241, the great Khan Urgide, son of Genghis and ruler of all the Mongols, died. His death triggered a political law as fundamental to the empire as gravity. All senior princes of the blood, especially those leading major armies like Batu Khan, were required to return to the capital at Karakorum for a grand council called a Kurultai. This was not a suggestion, it was an absolute command. The Kurultai was the mechanism that held the fractious empire together, where the next great Khan would be elected from among Genghis's descendants. To be absent was to forfeit all claim to power, influence, and the spoils of conquest. For Batu, continuing his campaign in distant Hungary suddenly became a secondary concern. His political future, and potentially his life, depended on his presence at that council. The need to secure his position and ensure his branch of the family retained its privileges outweighed any strategic advantage in Europe. So he gave the order to withdraw. The retreat was not a panic flight, but a deliberate, orderly evacuation. They took everything of value, including the population of entire towns they had relocated to repopulate their own territories. They left behind a ghost kingdom, empty and broken, but free. For Europe, it felt like a miracle, a divine deliverance. In reality, it was a matter of imperial politics, a reminder that the fate of nations can hinge on a single death in a distant land. The Mongols had come like a force of nature, and they left because of a rule. The land the Mongols left behind was not a kingdom, but a wound. The year 1242 in Hungary was a season of ghosts. Where there had been bustling market towns, there were now charred timbers and silent streets. The rich fields of the Pannonian Plain, which should have been green with spring wheat, lay fallow and choked with weeds, and tended because there was no one left to tend them. Contemporary chroniclers, their voices trembling with horror, estimated that nearly half of the entire population was gone. Some were the soldiers slaughtered at Mohi and in the merciless pursuit that followed. But just as many were the civilians who died in the year of occupation that came after from famine, from disease, from being marched eastward into slavery. The kingdom's human tapestry had been ripped in two. In village after village, the survivors emerged from forests and swamps to find their homes gone and their neighbors missing. The social order, the intricate web of obligations between lord and peasant, between town and crown, had been vaporized. Royal authority simply ceased to exist. King Béla was a refugee, moving from one foreign court to another, begging for help that was slow to come. There was no army to command, no treasury to draw from, no functioning government to issue orders. The local barons who survived were holed up in their stone castles, concerned only with their own survival, their loyalty to a vanished crown now a secondary thought. This was the true, devastating victory of the Mongols, achieved not in a single day of battle, but in the hollowed-out silence that followed. The trauma was societal, a deep shock to the collective spirit. People lived in a state of perpetual dread, jumping at shadows, convinced the Mongols would return any day. The clergy preached that the invasion had been God's punishment for the kingdom's sins, a belief that twisted grief into guilt and made the process of healing even harder. Recovery would not be a matter of simply rebuilding walls and planting new crops. It was the painstaking work of rebuilding trust, of reweaving a shared identity, of learning to hope again in a world that had proven itself capable of ending without warning. The Battle of Mohi was not just a military defeat. It was the moment the clock of Hungarian history stopped, and the long, painful work of restarting it began. A king returned to a kingdom of ghosts. Béla IV rode back into Hungary in the summer of 1242, not to a victory parade, but to a silent, broken land. The plains were empty, the towns were ashes, and the shadow of the Mongol horse still seemed to darken the horizon. He had survived, but his survival now carried an immense burden, the duty to ensure such a catastrophe could never happen again. This was the genesis of his life's work, a transformation so profound it would earn him a new title, Béla II Founder. His response to the trauma of Mohi was not just to rebuild, but to reinvent. He launched a national project of survival, a fortress building program on a scale Europe had never seen, funded by a desperate king with the plundered wealth of his own ruined nobility. He confiscated lands from baronial families that had been wiped out at Mohi and poured those resources into constructing a network of stone castles. These were not the wooden motte and bailey forts of old, but formidable strongholds of rock built on strategic hills and at vital river crossings, designed to withstand the siege engines and the storms of arrows that had broken his army. He invited new settlers from Germany, from Poland, from the south, offering them land and freedom in exchange for populating the devastated regions and swearing loyalty directly to the crown. This was more than reconstruction. It was a deliberate re-engineering of Hungarian society and power. The old model of a royal army reliant on the private forces of proud, independent barons had died at Mohi. Béla centralized military authority, creating a stronger royal army and binding the new castle lords directly to him. He turned the kingdom inward, from an open plain ideal for cavalry charges into a land of stone obstacles. The psychological shift was as important as the stone walls. The people, once living in terror of the open horizon, now had places of refuge they could see and touch. These castles became symbols of a new resilience. Decades later, when the Mongols returned in 1285, they found a completely different kingdom. Their raids, once unstoppable floods, now broke against a chain of stone islands. They could still ravage the countryside, but they could not capture the strongholds, could not shatter the kingdom's core, and could not repeat the total victory of Mohi. Béla's desperate castle building program, born from utter defeat, had created a fortress that would define Hungary for centuries, and ultimately proved that the lessons of a massacre, however painful, could forge an unbreakable defense. News of the disaster at Mohi flowed west like a cold river. In Vienna, citizens watched the Danube with dread, expecting any day to see the strange, triangular sails of Mongol scout boats. In Paris, King Louis IX, later Saint Louis, interrupted his plans for a crusade to the Holy Land to instead fortify the city's walls, a direct and terrified response to rumors of an Eastern apocalypse. The panic was not just political, it was deeply spiritual. Clergymen in cathedral pulpits from Cologne to Rome declared the Mongols to be the scourge of God, the armies of Gog and Magog from biblical prophecy, unleashed upon a sinful Christendom as a final warning before the end of days. This was a fear that bypassed reason and settled deep in the bone, a collective nightmare given flesh and hoof. In this atmosphere of existential terror, Pope Innocent IV saw a fleeting chance. He issued urgent calls for a united Christian crusade against the Mongol invaders, framing it as a holy war for the very survival of Europe. It was a logical, necessary response. And it failed completely. The kingdoms and principalities of Europe, though sharing a faith and a common foe, were prisoners of their own rivalries. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II was locked in a bitter struggle with the papacy itself. France and England were entangled in their own disputes. The Italian city-states were focused on maritime trade. Each ruler saw the Mongol threat through the lens of his own immediate interests, calculating whether the storm would hit his neighbor harder or hoping it might weaken a rival. The profound, unifying terror was not enough to overcome centuries of suspicion and ambition. So no grand army marched east, no coalition formed. Europe faced its greatest peril not as a united fortress, but as a collection of quarreling houses, each boarding up its own windows while the hurricane gathered force. This failure to unite in 1242 stands as one of history's great pivot points of inaction. The Mongols withdrew for their own reasons, but they left behind a continent that had proven it could not mount a coordinated defense. Had the great Khan Urgide lived another year, or had Batu Khan returned west after the Subutai, the fragmented states of Europe would have faced the full, focused might of the Mongol Empire alone, one by one. The plains of Germany, the hills of Italy, the fields of France, none had a defensive system like Béla's new castles. The missed opportunity for unity was a silent, collective gamble with civilization itself. a gamble that only fate's distant intervention in Mongolia allowed them to win. For the generals who survived Mohi, the battle was a nightmare, but in the yurts and command tents of the Mongol Empire, it became something else entirely, a blueprint. The clash on the Sajo River was not just a victory, it was a masterclass, a near-perfect execution of principles that defined Mongol warfare for generations. Military historians would later dissect it as the textbook example of Subutai's operational art, a symphony of movement and misdirection where every note was played precisely. The opening movement was the feigned retreat, that tantalizing lure that drew Duke Frederick's knights to their doom, proving that willful weakness could be the sharpest weapon. Then came the strategic diversion, Batu Khan's thunderous, all-consuming assault on the stone bridge. This was the grand spectacle, the crashing cymbals that held the entire audience's gaze, making them forget the rest of the orchestra was already in position. The silent, nocturnal third movement was the Night March, a logistical miracle of 30,000 men and horses moving like ghosts through the dark to find the unguarded ford. This was the pivot, the moment the composition shifted key, turning the enemy's secure flank into their exposed rear. The finale was the envelopment itself, the two wings of the Mongol force closing like the jaws of a predator, transforming a fortified camp into a sealed tomb. For Mongol cadets and future commanders, Mohi was the case study. It demonstrated that terrain was not a barrier but a tool, that time and space were elements to be manipulated, and that the enemy's mind was the ultimate battlefield. The victory did not just break a kingdom, it cemented a reputation. From that point forward, the mere rumor of a Mongol army approaching could paralyze defenders, because the legend of Mohi whispered that they were not just facing soldiers, but an inevitable, inescapable force of nature. Their doctrine of total war, psychological, logistical, and tactical, had been validated on a European stage. Every future campaign, whether in the Middle East or against the Song dynasty in China, carried the ghost of this perfect battle in its planning. It was the high watermark of a specific kind of military genius, a reminder that sometimes the most devastating victories are not won by sheer strength, but by convincing your enemy they have already lost before the true fight even begins. The fields where 80,000 men fought and died hold their secrets close. Centuries have passed, yet the exact ground of the Battle of Mohi remains one of history's stubborn, silent puzzles. We know it happened near the Sajo River in the spring of 1241, but pinning the clash to a specific field, a particular hill, has proven maddeningly elusive for archaeologists. This is not for lack of trying. Generations of researchers, armed with maps and metal detectors, have walked the plains, searching for the physical echo of that day. What they find, more often than not, is a profound and puzzling absence. The challenge begins with sheer scale. The engagement was not a single clash on a neat, contained plot. It was a sprawling, multi-phase event covering miles from the stone bridge to the flanking march to the fortified camp, and finally the horrific slaughter in the Kapolna Pass. This operational area could encompass dozens of square kilometers of modern farmland and forest. Whereas one even begin to dig, then there is the landscape itself, a living thing that has shifted over 8 centuries. The Sajo River has changed its course more than once since the 13th century, its meanders altering the very geography of the floodplain. What was a marsh in 1241 might be a cornfield today. What was a vital ford could now lie under meters of silt or a modern village. The land has been plowed, built upon, and eroded, constantly churning the soil and burying evidence ever deeper. But the most haunting aspect of the search is the nature of the evidence they seek. A battle like Mohi, for all its carnage, may not leave a dense, concentrated layer of relics for archaeologists to find. Think about the aftermath. The Mongols were meticulous scavengers. They spent days after the battle systematically collecting every piece of valuable metal, swords, armor, arrowheads, coins, even the nails from boots and wagon. This plunder was their fuel, their currency. They left behind what they considered trash, broken bones, shattered wood, and perhaps the occasional lost trinket. Then, over the following centuries, local peasants would have combed the same ground after every spring plow. picking up any remaining bits of iron or bronze to be melted down and reused. This process of continuous recycling means the material footprint of a massive medieval battle can be astonishingly faint. A few scattered arrowheads, a horse's bridle ring, a single deformed bullet from a later era mistaken for something else. These fragmented clues are what historians must piece together. This absence fuels both serious scholarship and wild speculation. For every academic carefully surveying a grid, there is a treasure hunter dreaming of the lost royal horde of King Béla, supposedly buried during the retreat. The mystery keeps the battle alive, transforming it from a closed chapter in a book into an open question lying just beneath the grass. It means that somewhere, under the quiet soil of eastern Hungary, the truth of Mohi still waits, patient and silent, for a spade or a scanner to finally tell its full story. The silence after the battle was not just one of absence, but of hidden things. While the Mongols carried away wagon loads of plunder, legends insist that far more wealth vanished that day, swallowed by the Hungarian earth itself. As the kingdom dissolved into panic, nobles and knights faced an agonizing choice. They could not escape with their heavy chests of gold, their family reliquaries, or the ceremonial regalia of their rank. So, the stories say, they buried them. They chose a distinctive tree, a bend in a creek, or a lonely hillock, dug a frantic hole under the cover of darkness, and consigned their fortunes to the dirt, praying for a day of return that for most would never come. This gave birth to one of Europe's most persistent treasure hunting myths. Specific tales have echoed for centuries. There is the lost crown of Béla IV, not the official royal diadem, but a personal treasure of jewels and gold supposedly hidden during his desperate flight. Then, there is the fabled horde of the Knights Templar, who fought and died at the bridge. Could a contingent of their knights have buried the order's wealth before being overrun, a secret lost with the last man who knew its location? These are not just fanciful stories, they are psychological artifacts of a trauma. When an entire social order vanishes overnight, the mind fills the void with legends of hidden glory, a promise that something of value survived the obliteration. The Mongols, of course, took their own mountains of treasure eastward, a train of wealth that itself entered the realm of myth. As Batu Khan's column retreated through the Carpathian passes, laden with the loot of a kingdom, some tales whisper of a portion being lost, a wagon tumbling into a ravine during a storm, a cache hidden during a skirmish and never recovered. This fusion of historical plunder and speculative loss creates a powerful allure. Even today, amateur archaeologists and treasure hunters scan fields with metal detectors, drawn by the dream of finding a rusted sword hilt or a single gold coin that whispers of the great disappearance. The real treasure of Mohi, however, may be more profound than gold. It is the enduring human need to believe that from absolute loss, something precious can still be recovered, waiting just beneath the surface for a lucky stroke to bring it back into the light. The trauma of Mohi did not end with the last arrow. It seeped into the soul of the nation, becoming a dark, fertile soil from which stories grew. For centuries, the battle was not just a historical event in Hungary, it was a living ghost, a shared memory passed down in fireside tales and haunting folk songs. In the villages, parents warned their children of the Tartars, a name that conjured not just Mongol warriors, but every fear of the unknown East. This period entered the language as the Tartar yoke, a phrase that meant more than foreign rule. It meant a time of utter powerlessness, of homes burned and a future stolen. The folk tradition painted the invaders not as disciplined soldiers, but as demonic hordes, creatures of almost supernatural cruelty. Songs told of heroes who stood against impossible odds, of villages that hid in forests, and of a land weeping in blood. These were not accurate histories, they were emotional truths, a way for a people to process a catastrophe too vast to comprehend through facts alone. The figure of the king who fled, Béla, was often softened in these tales, transformed into a tragic figure who suffered with his people, his survival a necessary thread of hope rather than a failure. This folklore served a vital purpose. It kept the memory of the loss alive, but it also began the slow work of forging a new identity from the ashes. Mohi became the foundational tragedy, the before and after line in the story of the nation. It was the wound that explained why they were cautious, why they built castles, why they looked east with a wary eye. The battle taught a brutal lesson about the cost of disunity and the necessity of strong defenses, a lesson etched not just in stone, but in the very songs they sang to their children. To be Hungarian for generations was to carry the memory of Mohi in your bones, a scar that reminded you what had been lost and what must never be lost again. This cultural memory transformed a military defeat into a cornerstone of national resilience, a story of survival that ultimately proved stronger than the story of the slaughter. But what if the arrow had flown the other way? What if on that damp April morning, the Hungarian knights had somehow shattered Subutai's flanking force at the ford, or King Béla's barons had united as one, or the Cuman horsemen had remained to guard the army's rear? The Battle of Mohi stands as one of history's great hinges, a moment where the door to Europe swung wide open. If the Hungarians had held that door shut, the ripple effects would have washed over centuries. First, Eastern Europe's map would look profoundly different. A victorious Kingdom of Hungary, its prestige and military power unbroken, would have likely expanded its influence eastward, solidifying a Christian, feudal frontier along the Carpathians much earlier. The nascent kingdoms of Poland and the Rus principalities, spared the Mongol yoke that followed Mohi, might have developed stronger, more centralized states without the decades of tribute and devastation that historically crippled them. The political and cultural center of gravity for all of Europe could have shifted east, with a powerful Hungarian-led bloc acting as a permanent bulwark. Consider the papacy. Pope Innocent IV's call for a crusade against the Mongols, which fell on deaf ears after the disaster, might have instead become a unifying triumph for Christendom. A Hungarian victory would have been hailed as a miracle, a sign of divine favor that could have massively strengthened papal authority. The Pope could have positioned himself as the true defender of Europe, wielding moral and political power to unite fractious kings under a common banner in a way that the actual threat of invasion failed to do. This surge in centralized religious authority might have even altered the trajectory of the Reformation centuries later. And what of the empires yet unborn? The Ottoman Turks, who would later conquer Constantinople and push into the Balkans, faced a Hungary that was, in reality, still recovering from its Mongol wounds a century later. A stronger, more populous, and militarily confident Hungary could have been an impassable barrier, potentially containing Ottoman expansion at the Danube rather than at the gates of Vienna. The resources and focus of later European powers like Austria or the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth would have been freed for other ventures, perhaps altering colonial rivalries across the globe. This single day's outcome didn't just decide a battle, it set a course. The Mongol withdrawal after Urgiday's death felt like a miracle, but a Hungarian victory would have been a declaration, a statement that the steppe tide could be turned. The silence that followed Mohi was filled with ghosts and what-ifs, a reminder that sometimes the most important history is the path not taken, the future that vanished in the smoke of a burning wagon fort. 8 centuries later, the ghost of Subutai rides through modern war colleges. The principles that shattered the Hungarian army at Mohi are not dusty relics, they are living doctrine, dissected in classrooms from West Point to Sandhurst. The battle serves as a masterclass in what contemporary strategists call operational art, the level of warfare that links tactics to grand strategy. Take the core Mongol concept of the feigned retreat and the strategic diversion. At Mohi, this was the decoy attack on the bridge, the grand spectacle that fixed the enemy's attention while the real blow landed elsewhere. In the modern era, we see this echoed in the D-Day landings of World War II. The Allied deception campaign, Operation Fortitude, created an entire phantom army under General Patton, complete with fake radio traffic and inflatable tanks, convincing Hitler that the main invasion would come at Calais. This fixed German reserves far from the actual beaches of Normandy, just as Batu Khan's assault fixed the Hungarian mind on the stone bridge. The objective was identical, to misdirect the enemy's strategic reserves and create a fatal gap in their defenses. It is the same playbook, executed with radios and double agents instead of thundering hooves and flaming naphtha. The lesson is timeless. The best way to defeat an enemy is to first deceive them about where and when the true battle will even begin. Then, There is the relentless emphasis on mobility and tempo. The Mongol knight march to the ford was a logistical triumph that changed the entire geometry of the battle. They understood that speed is not just about moving fast, but about moving decisively before the enemy can react. This philosophy found its 20th century expression in the German Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. The goal was not to push an enemy back, but to use concentrated armor and air power to achieve deep penetrations, disrupting command and control, and encircling entire armies before they could establish a coherent defense. The parallel to Subutai's flanking force materializing behind the Hungarian camp is striking. Both strategies sought to bypass strongpoints, strike at rear areas, and induce a psychological collapse, turning an organized force into a confused mob. Modern maneuver warfare, the cornerstone of American and NATO doctrine, carries this same DNA. It prioritizes agility, initiative, and striking at critical vulnerabilities over grinding attrition. The commander, who can make decisions and move forces faster than their opponent, creates a cascading advantage, a reality as true for a Mongol Cuman on the steppe as for a mechanized brigade on a digital battlefield. Perhaps the most profound echo is in the realm of psychological warfare. The Mongols were masters of shaping the enemy's will to fight before the first physical clash. The terror that preceded them, the mysterious fire weapons, the sudden appearance of a second army from an impossible direction, all were designed to break morale. Today, this is understood as the cognitive domain of conflict. Modern militaries employ information operations, cyber attacks, and strategic messaging to demoralize populations, undermine trust in leadership, and paralyze decision-making. A coordinated cyber strike that takes down a nation's power grid hours before a physical invasion serves the same purpose as the flaming pots crashing into the Hungarian camp. It creates chaos, fear, and a sense of inevitable doom. The goal is to win not by destroying every soldier, but by convincing the enemy that resistance is futile. Mohi demonstrated that the most efficient victory targets the mind. When an army believes it has already lost, its physical destruction is often just a formality. So why does a battle fought with bows and horses still matter in an age of satellites and stealth bombers? Because technology changes, but the fundamental calculus of human conflict does not. The tools evolve, yet the objectives remain: outthink, outmaneuver, and undermine the enemy's will. The 35 key moments of Mohi form a timeless blueprint, a case study in how to achieve a decisive victory against a numerically superior foe. It reminds us that strategy is a craft, one where geography, perception, and speed are weapons as potent as any sword. When a modern general studies a map, planning how to deceive and dislocate an adversary, they are walking in the footsteps of an old Mongol strategist who once looked at a river, a forest, and a stone bridge and saw not obstacles, but the perfect pieces of a trap. The battle may be centuries old, but its lessons are forever new, whispering that the greatest victories are often won long before the first shot is ever fired. The plains of Mohi fell silent, but their echo never truly faded. From the first terrified reports of Mongol scouts in the mountain passes to the hollowed-out villages left in the wake of their withdrawal, this was an epic that reshaped a continent. It was a story told not in a single, thunderous clash, but in a relentless cascade of moments: a king's desperate welcome to refugees, a duke's fatal charge into a feigned retreat, the soft splash of 30,000 horses crossing a river in the dead of night, the crackle of strange fire raining on a fortified camp, and the final, suffocating crush in a narrow path. Each was a pivot point, a decision made in courage or arrogance, a stroke of tactical genius or a catastrophic blunder, all woven together by the thin, unpredictable thread of chance. The legacy of that April day is a double-edged sword. For Hungary, it remains a foundational trauma, a national wound that forged a fortress mentality and a king who rebuilt his realm from ashes. For students of strategy, it stands as an eternal masterclass, a textbook written in fire and blood on the arts of deception, maneuver, and psychological warfare. The battle asks us to look beyond simple tales of winners and losers, to see instead the intricate clockwork of history, where a misunderstood report, a misplaced bridge guard, or a death in a distant capital can alter the destiny of millions. In the end, the 35 moments of Mohi remind us that history is not a force that happens to us, but a tapestry woven from countless human choices. So we turn the final page over to you. As you look back through this epic of survival and slaughter, of cunning and calamity, which single moment lingers in your mind? Which decision, whether by a king or a common soldier, do you find the most pivotal, the most tragic, or the most brilliantly cunning? Share your thoughts below. The story may be centuries old, but the conversation about what it means is forever new. Their names are not carved into stone or sung in chronicles. While kings and khans dominate the story of Mohi, the true weight of the battle was carried on the shoulders of the forgotten. Picture, if you will, not the grand strategy, but the individual heartbeats lost in the noise. The nameless knight from a minor noble house who stood on that stone bridge, his feet planted on the cold, damp stone as the first flaming pots arced through the dawn sky. He held the line not for glory or a kingdom, but for the man next to him until an arrow found a gap in his visor. His family would wait for a letter that never came, his fate reduced to a single, agonizing word, missing. Then there were the camp followers, the blacksmiths, the cooks, the laundresses, the wives and children who traveled with the army, creating a mobile city of support. They did not choose the battlefield, but they shared its fate. When the fire rained down and the encirclement closed, they had no war horses, no armor, only the desperate will to live. They perished in the smoke or were trampled in the panic, their stories erased as completely as their footprints in the muddy field. We must also remember the Cuman warriors, those steppe horsemen caught between worlds. After their Khan was murdered, some fled, but others likely remained, trapped by circumstance or fragile loyalty. In the chaos of the retreat, a Cuman rider, far from his homeland and rejected by his would-be allies, might have fought with a unique despair, understanding the tactics of his Mongol cousins even as he died beneath their arrows. His death was a tragedy within a tragedy, a man without a country on a field that claimed all, and finally, consider the Hungarian peasants who survived. They returned from forests to find their villages ash, their fields salted or fallow, their lords dead. Their heroism was not of a single day, but of 1,000 slow, grinding days that followed. They were the ones who, with blistered hands and broken hearts, cleared the rubble, replanted the scorched earth, and slowly, painfully, rebuilt a world from nothing. They bore the silent burden of the aftermath, ensuring that life, in its stubborn, humble way, would continue. These are the unsung heroes of Mohi. For every grand tactic on a map, there were 10,000 personal dramas of courage, fear, and sacrifice. History remembers the sweep of empires, but it is woven from these invisible threads. When we reduce Mohi to a clash of strategies, we risk forgetting the human cost that gives those strategies their terrible meaning. So as the final dust settles on this story, let it settle on them. The unnamed, the unrecorded, the countless individual destinies swallowed by the grand narrative of a single bloody day. They are the true echo of the battle, a whisper that reminds us that behind every pivot point in history, there stands a person.